Well, let's talk about all this with Tom Tugendhat. He's chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and a Conservative MP. Good morning to you, Tom.
Good morning, Julia. How are you?
Very well indeed. You and I have spoken so many times about the threat from China and how that we've been treating China for far too long as a sort of normal nation state when it is far from that. You're welcome. I'm assuming very welcoming of what the British government has offered in terms of going further for these 5-year visas for 3 million Hong Kongers. But do you want the government to go further than that, given that we don't necessarily have any protection for another 6 million people from Hong Kong? Certainly a lot of the young people protesting wouldn't be eligible for those visas or those passports, and of course there's no reason to think that China will necessarily allow those Chinese citizens who want those Hong Kong citizens who want to take up British citizenship to leave the country. What do you want to hear from the government today?
Well, there's a range of points there, Julia. Let me try and take them one by one. First of all, yes, I do welcome what the government's done. As you know, I've been calling for it for a number of years, and I'm extremely glad that the government is doing the right thing and is recognising that we have a responsibility to British citizens, to British nationals rather, whether they're at home or abroad. And I think the fact that in a China Research Group survey that came out yesterday or the day before, I can't remember now, forgive me, it pointed out that more than 2/3 of British citizens agree with the government's position on this. And I think that shows the generosity and openness of the British people, which has been questioned rather too much in recent years. But I think you and I both know it's true. Now, the next question is, what do we do about everyone? And the reality is, Julia, we've got to do what we can, but that doesn't mean we can fix every problem that's there. And in a funny way, actually, what we really need to do is show the example so that others can look at finding their own solutions too. And it's quite noticeable that Australia, the United States, Taiwan, Japan, Canada, and many other places are already looking at their similar sort of lifeboat scheme, if you like, to help Hong Kong citizens who require exile. And though nobody wants Hong Kongers to be forced out of their homes, nobody wants them to have to abandon their lives and move away. Offering the ability to leave a tyrannical regime, sadly, is something that I think we have a responsibility for.
Well, indeed. The trouble is that we now know, we knew long ago, Beijing doesn't hold to its word because they signed that 1997 treaty. It's lodged with the UN. The UN, there's going to be lots of sort of hand-wringing, isn't there? But there's not going to be any action. We've discussed it before. We ain't sending the gunboats in. We know that. There's very little that can be done other than perhaps economic sanctions. Do you think that we will go to the point of economic sanctions which are meaningful?
Well, I hope that we will do so in a targeted fashion. I don't think there's a need for economic sanctions on the whole of China. I think that would be unhelpful and unproductive. But I hope that when we bring in the so-called Magnitsky Act, and when it becomes law and the government starts to use it, what we will do is we will see targeted sanctions on individuals who are either directly connected to repression in Hong Kong, the violation of civil liberties and the silencing of democracy, or perhaps even more importantly, and I know this isn't an area we've spoken about quite as much, though you do cover it, and I'm sorry to say many people don't, it's the mass detention of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, where 1.5 million are in concentration camps, and the mass sterilization of Uyghur women in a form of ethnic cleansing, which is absolutely horrific.
Yes, it is extraordinary what's going on there. And again, we read these articles and then we sort of go, OK, and everyone shrugs and moves on. If this was happening in any other country, there'd be mass protests. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Can you imagine? I mean, Huawei, for example, is an integral part of the Chinese security state. It's a Chinese company, so perhaps that's not very surprising. But it provides data infrastructure, there's a communications infrastructure to the Chinese security state that is using it to conduct these mass arrests and this total surveillance. Can you imagine signing up with a company like that in Germany in 1937?
Yeah, it's a very fair point. I mean, do you think now it's going to be really clear that the government cannot go ahead with Huawei being involved in the 5G network? And we're told that there isn't an alternative. There isn't a Western democracy alternative to the Huawei technology. But given that most of the technology that the Chinese economy thrives on is basically stolen, copyrighted intellectual property rights from the West, I do find that quite hard to believe. And I think a lot of people do.
Well, first of all, there is no alternative except for Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung, Fujitsu, Cisco. I can keep going if you like. There are alternatives. Of course, there are alternatives. And you're right that intellectual property theft is a big issue. We've got to, however, recognize that while you're right originally, Julia, the situation has changed. And China's investment through Huawei and other companies into development and research is really quite remarkable. Huawei has spent more on research in the last year than Apple has ever spent on research. Now, that's quite something. So you're right that it may have started with intellectual property theft, but they are now advancing by hard work, frankly. And we've got to realise that this is a competition that we need to be part of.
Okay. And in terms of, you mentioned your very sort of targeted economic sanctions. And Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, was talking yesterday about having these targeted sanctions on figures in the Chinese regime. But under the Magnitsky. But realistically, though, this isn't going to be enough to deter the Chinese. We're unlikely to see any serious action from Donald Trump while he's in the presidency, even though the vote in the House of Representatives yesterday for these targeted sanctions as well. Realistically, there isn't going to be anything more than a wringing of hands and the Office of Citizenship to the people of Hong Kong. There's nothing that's going to stop Beijing from carrying on. Does this need to be a wake-up call to Britain, to America, to EU, to the whole of the West, that we need to start treating China not as an economic bloc that's a useful trading body that we can get lots of cheap goods from them, but as a hostile force that we need to reckon with sooner or later? And perhaps we need to get to grips with the fact that it's going to come sooner than many of us like.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure you're wrong, but I'm more hopeful that you're wrong on China changing. And the reason I say that is there's a few indications that the central unity of the administration may not be quite as tight as it wants you to imagine. Like all dictatorships, it wants to pretend that it's all powerful, all central, and it all has one mind. And yet, a few weeks after the huge spike in deaths in Wuhan over COVID a number of months ago, there was a day of mourning around the whole of China. That was not something that was sanctioned by the supreme leader, by General Secretary Xi. So that in itself is interesting, that there are divergent views within the central administration. Secondly, we know, because they've abandoned the GDP target of 6% for the first time since the 1990s, that China is deeply concerned about the economic fallout of COVID, as indeed we all are. But unlike us in democracies where our governments have a legitimacy because they've been chosen by the people, dictatorships don't have that legitimacy. Their only legitimacy is in their actions. And if they can't deliver, well, that raises some very serious questions. So there's a real question there as to whether or not the internal pressures will cause changes in the way it behaves. So I'm not quite as negative as all that. I think there are real pressures on the Chinese Communist Party. But what we really need to see is us banding together with countries around the world. You and I, Julia, have been critical of the United States withdrawing from some international organizations. Of course, they're right to complain about the WHO, but to abandon it, I'm not sure. What we need to do is we need to get partners and allies who are willing to stand up for the international rules-based system, because it's what has allowed us to prosper in peace for the best part of, what is it now, 70, 80 years? And so getting countries like South Korea and Japan, India, Singapore, Brazil, Nigeria to actually stand up and be counted in this debate is really, really matters, because what they're defending is they're not defending Britain, they're not defending the UN. What they're defending is their own ability to travel and trade freely and in peace, and that is hugely important for everyone.